What is going on, everybody? So it's been a long time since the last ROG Ally Ultimate Power Saver and Performance Guide video. So I decided to reintroduce this guide to you all through a massive compilation that's over an hour and 30 minutes long. So if you want to get the most out of your experience with your ROG Ally with the best possible battery life and performance, this is the actual ultimate guide available. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this mega-sized ROG Ally Ultimate Power Saver and Performance Guide.
What is going on, everybody? Hope you're having a good weekend. So I've been going on and on about the ROG Ally. I've been making videos left and right, mostly because I've been spending a week exclusively playing my games in silent mode. So I can find out what is the absolute best way to save the most battery while playing your ROG Ally. And there are variations of ways to make sure you're optimizing your system enough to have both great battery life and performance. And this is the first of the ROG Ally Power Saver and Performance Guide. So there are a few steps you need to go through in order to get the best performance while saving an optimal amount of battery. And usually the top way to do this is to put your ROG Ally in silent mode. So all of these games that I'm going to test have been tested exclusively in silent mode. But not only that, I put the battery profile in Windows 11 on Power Saver. So if you're not using it, it turns off after every 5 minutes or so, depending on what kind of timer you put the screensaver or sleep mode on. But as a lot of you know, silent mode isn't exactly what people thought it would be. Most people just use silent mode and Power Saver to surf the web or download something or even play a small indie game. But that is not the main factor in order to save the most power on your ROG Ally. There is something called memory integrity, which protects your ROG Ally and the general OS from any malicious software like malware or viruses, and protects your information against those threats. But as long as you're not going in any shady sites or downloading any pirated games from shady sites, as long as you're staying away from those actions, disabling integrity should be okay. So, since this is the first official step, disabling memory integrity is not that hard. All you have to do is go to the start menu and search device security. Now select that and you're going to see core isolation details. Select that and you'll see the option right there, disable memory integrity, and just toggle it off, and Windows 11 will notify you that you need to restart your system. All you have to do is restart it and voila, your performance will be a lot better while going into silent mode or lowering your TDP to 10 watts. After disabling memory integrity, I saw a 10 to 15% performance boost with every performance profile, including turbo, performance, and especially silent mode. The system still had trouble keeping steady frames in 1080p in some cases in silent mode, so you won't be able to reach 1080p with a lot of titles, since 10 watts just, for the most part, doesn't properly support that resolution. But surprisingly, there were a few games I tested that worked very well at 1080p with only 10 watts in silent mode. And disabling that security measure actually made silent mode useful. And while testing all of these games, I had the brightness at 50%, I turned the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth off, and of course, I only set the ROG Ally to silent mode. But with the brightness, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth set to off and 50%, that helped me get an extra 15 to 20 minutes of game time. So let's start this list, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised what kind of numbers I got. So the first game I tested was Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. I managed to get 3 hours out of this game by setting the resolution to 720p, locked 60 FPS. Somehow I got 3 hours with this, and it is an older title that was on Xbox 360 and PS3, but don't forget this is a specific port to PS4 and PC, as well as Xbox One. So considering that, getting 3 hours on this while going 720p, 60 FPS, because that's the same resolution that the consoles were set at. The next game I tried is of course Resident Evil 2 Remake. Naturally, I really wanted to push it. So at 1080p, low to medium settings at 90% resolution, I managed to get 2 hours and 45 minutes out of this title. It looked incredible and it played fairly well. The FPS was around 35 to 40. And don't forget, this is in silent mode. When knocking down the resolution to 720p, you get about 45 to 50 FPS with high settings. And That's with the normal rendering method enabled. With the interlaced rendering method, you can reach up to 60 FPS with 3 hours of battery on the ROG Ally. And don't forget, that is at 720p. 1080p could honestly vary from 2 hours and 30 minutes to 2 hours and 45 minutes. But most likely you're going to get 2 hours and 45 minutes out of this title, regardless. So you may as well just keep the resolution at 1080p, set the rendering method to interlaced, and have a good time. The next game I tried was Wanted Dead. A lot of people don't like this game, including myself, but there's something about it that makes me just want to play it portably. It just seems like a brain-dead sort of shooter. And at 720p, low settings, locked at 30 FPS, I managed to get 2 hours and 45 minutes out of this title. For some reason, this hideous game requires a lot of graphical power, so this is all I could squeeze out of it. The next game I tried is something that you can't find on Steam, and that is Operation Raccoon City. I managed to get 3 hours out of this title at 1080p 30 FPS. You can get an extra 10 to 15 minutes if you bring the resolution down to 720p. It'll still remain at 60 FPS, like with the 1080p setting variant, and the settings at high. And I remember this game back in the Xbox 360 days. It wasn't very liked by a lot of people, but the online mode was so much fun. It was sort of a Dead by Daylight before Dead by Daylight. And honestly, it's a very underrated game, considering what it did. Now, the next title I tried was Death Stranding. Surprisingly, I managed to get 3 hours out of this title. I set the resolution to 720p, medium settings, and got a consistent 30 FPS. And this is only if you want to set all of these games to silent mode and don't want to mess with the TDP or anything like that. It's a simple process and you get plenty of battery life out of titles like Death Stranding. And the next game I mention frequently, and that is Ultra Street Fighter 4. I managed to get 2 hours and 30 minutes out of this game at 1080p, locked 60 FPS, and 3 hours and 720p resolution with, again, locked 60 FPS. Playing this game for 2 hours and 30 minutes at 1080p, 60 FPS was pretty much something that dreams are made out of. It's an incredible experience, even in silent mode. And Ultra Street Fighter 4 isn't that old. The next game I tested, you can't find in the Steam store, and that is Gears of War 1. This game lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes at 1080p, locked 60 FPS. Somehow, I guess deactivating that security measure, which was memory integrity, made some kind of magic happen. Because at 720p with a locked 60 FPS, Gears of War 1 lasts 3 hours and 10 minutes. And that's a great amount of time, especially to spend with a game as legendary as Gears of War 1. And that's the official PC port. Now, the next game I tested is, of course, Catherine Classic. This lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes at 1080p, locked 60 FPS. And in some instances, the game can go up to 80 FPS, but limiting the FPS to 60 is recommended, especially if you want to save the most battery life. At 720p, 60 FPS, the game lasts about 3 hours and 20 minutes. So yeah, I'm going to play this game a lot. The second to last title I tested was Metro 2033. This lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes at 1080p, 45 to 60 FPS. But because the VRR is always on, it smooths the FPS out a great deal. And at 720p, the game lasts 3 hours and 20 minutes at a pretty much locked 60 FPS and higher if you wanted to. But that's going to affect your battery life, so try to keep it at 60. The final title I tested was Soul Calibur 6. I got 2 hours and 50 minutes with this game at 720p with the screen quality set to auto, just so you can get that 60 FPS or just a smooth frame rate. Because when you have the screen quality set to anything else at 10 watts in silent mode, you're most likely going to see a great deal of slowdown during gameplay. But yeah, those were the 10 games that I tested. And after disabling memory integrity, I was surprised with how much of a performance boost the Ally got from that simple change. So that goes to show, with a tiny bit of research, I was able to get 10 to 15% of a performance boost. And that's all while using Windows 11. And it made me realize Windows seems to prioritize security measures over actual performance, and that proves Microsoft needs to rework their OS to better optimize it for gaming specifically. Because if toggling that simple option gave me such a performance boost with something that was supposed to be enabled with the OS, it just shows where their priorities are. And there is another option that you can disable, but I couldn't seem to find it. It's called TPM, which is a different kind of protection for malware, but it's connected to the license with your Windows 11. So I didn't want to mess with that too much or at all, because I wanted Windows to continue to update. Some people disable that, and it seemed to get rid of the audio crackling that might take place during silent mode with certain games. But since it's connected connected to the Windows 11 license, I don't know if it's a good idea to toggle that on or off. It was supposedly in the BIOS, but I didn't see it anywhere. Maybe ASUS disabled the option to enable or disable it, who knows. But besides that specific option, you are able to tweak the settings here and there to get some performance boost. And regarding all the security measures that Microsoft throws at you, it's not really their fault to obsess over safety. Viruses have plagued the OS since the early 90s and onward. I'm just glad silent mode has finally become a viable option after switching around just that one setting. And if you're on the fence about disabling memory integrity, again, it's a tool mainly used to stop complex malware processes. If you're staying away from shady websites or anything like that, you have nothing to worry about. But just keep in mind you have to be extra safe with downloading or visiting certain websites if you disable that option. But yeah, with these settings, you'll end up getting a big performance boost in all performance profiles and that extra bit of battery life to boot. And hopefully with this video, all the Steam Deck stands can stop complaining about the ROG Ally's battery life, because with the settings and steps I showed you, you can most likely get the same battery life you would with the Steam Deck with certain games, but with even more resolution in some cases.
What is going on, everybody? And welcome finally to the second ROG Ally Power Saver and Performance Guide. It has been a long time coming, and for the most part, I've been testing out these specific games in this list throughout my entire time owning an ROG Ally. And before we get started, to save the most battery possible, make sure your brightness is half or 75%. And if you're playing single player titles, just make sure your Wi-Fi is turned off as well as your Bluetooth if you're not using headphones or an external controller for tabletop gameplay. And for every game on this list, all of these games were tested in silent mode. And to get the best performance and battery life possible, make sure to switch your VRAM to either auto or 4 gigabytes. This will give you a huge performance boost in silent mode, while switching to 8 gigabytes will give you more room for high fidelity graphics. But 8 gigabytes is more recommended if you're playing docked, while the 4 gigabyte option is ideal for most situations, especially silent mode. And also with every game on the list, it should be noted that VSync will be turned off and 120 Hz mode enabled to use variable refresh rates. And if you're coming from the last Power Saver and Performance Guide, there are initial settings to help performance that could be considered risky. But if you do want to know everything in your power to save as much battery life as possible, maybe you want to check out the first Power Saver and Performance Guide for the ROG Ally, and I'll provide a link down below. But opposed to the first fix that I provided in the first Performance Guide, here's a new fix specifically to fix audio crackling that occurs with low TDP modes like silent mode on your ROG Ally. First, you have to go to the search bar in Windows and type mmsys.cpl to open Windows 11 sound settings. Select the main speakers, go to properties, and turn off spatial sound, because it seems like this specific sound setting is power intensive for the ROG Ally. So turn it off. Will also save a bit of power, but you won't get that surround sound like effect with the speakers. But this is only if the crackling is occurring for you with speakers or headphones. And if the sound crackling is occurring with your headphones, you just have to follow the same steps and go to your headphone settings, properties, and turn off spatial sound with your headphones. It seems to be some kind of glitch in silent mode with Dolby Atmos. There are other ways to fix this, like uninstalling and reinstalling your ROG Ally's audio drivers, but that's a little bit on the risky side. I heard that helps some people. I've been looking on Reddit for a little while, and the temporary fix that you can just switch back on whenever you go back into performance or turbo is just turning off spatial sounds. But with that said, and with that fix hopefully noted on your side, let's start the Power Saver and Performance Guide list. So the first game on the list is one of my favorite racing games and open world racing games at that, and it is Fuel. Now, Fuel is one of the biggest racing games with over 5,000 square miles in its multi-routed and sectioned off map, and it's 5,560 square miles to be exact. But besides the staggering amount of content and open world space in Fuel, in silent mode, 1080p with 40 to 60 FPS, you'll get around 4 hours of gameplay. An incredible amount with the amount of content and how big the map is in this title. If you haven't tried Fuel, it's kind of hard to spot on Steam. I don't think they're selling it anymore, but there are third-party versions that you can get and play offline on the go on your ROG Ally. And you would get about 4 hours at 1080p mode, but at 720, you can reach 4 hours and 45 minutes to even 5
5 hours with this title at steady FPS. With 720p, you will get a guaranteed 60 FPS. And that's, of course, everything at high settings, with, of course, VSync off. And the variable refresh rate helps this game run even smoother since it's going from 40 to 60 FPS constantly depending on how big the area is that you're traversing through. And the next game on the list is one of my favorites. It's kind of a strange one, but it's by Suda51. Now, this is one of my top directors in video game history, and he's someone that made some of the most iconic franchises and characters known to the industry. And this game is Killer is Dead. Now, this is one of Suda51's newer titles for the PS3, but he doesn't make too many AAA type games, so seeing Killer is Dead and how incredibly awesome it looks with its art style, characters, and level design, this definitely has a lot of Suda51's personality in it. And at 1080p, 30 to 60 FPS, depending on if you mess with the settings to get 60 FPS or higher, I managed to get 3 hours and 20 minutes with this title on, of course, silent mode. And sometimes the FPS would even hit 70 in silent mode and still last about 3 hours. But if you want to limit the FPS to 60 so you'll get more time out of this game, I highly recommend that as well. And at 720p, with, of course, default to high settings, you'll get about 4 hours with Killer is Dead. And just to reiterate, make sure your brightness is set to 50 or 75%, your Wi-Fi turned off, and your Bluetooth turned off if you're not using it. That helps to save a ton of battery, and for each setting you turn off, you save about 10 minutes. So you get an extra at least 30 minutes of game time with Killer is Dead. And this game has all sorts of twists and turns and unusually satisfying bosses, to the point I just get sucked into this game and play for the full 3 hours by mistake. But if you haven't checked out Killer is Dead already, it is sort of a niche title, so being able to play this game at full resolution, full FPS for 3 hours straight minimum on the go is a dream come true, especially for me. Now, the next title is a game I've been talking about for a while. It's another racing game, an open world one. If you guessed it, it's Forza Horizon 4. With this title at 1080p, 40 to 60 FPS, but a seamless transition between those frames thanks to VRR, you'll be able to get minimum 2 hours and 45 minutes at 1080p, 60 FPS. I don't know how they did it, but there are some settings you should know about. All you have to do is make sure dynamic optimization is turned on and dynamic render quality is set to high. If you make sure those settings are set in that certain way, then you will get the best FPS and with the highest resolution. And just for shits and giggles, at 720p, 60 FPS, I managed to get Forza Horizon 4 to last 3 hours minimum. So it sometimes lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes, depending what kind of area you're in, and make sure always to set the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth off if you're not playing online. Now, I was offline because I was playing the offline mode of this game, because at the end of the day, I was just tired of signing into Xbox and Microsoft accounts over and over again every time I wanted to play this title. And there are other issues with the base Steam version, but for the most part, you will get the same exact battery life if you are playing either a third-party version or the Steam version. Now, for this next title, it was a big hitter with the Nintendo Switch with a surprise release, and that is Outlast 1, including the Whistleblower DLC. With this title at 1080p, 60 FPS, of course, I managed to get a staggering 4 hours and 40 minutes with Outlast 1 on high settings, and everything else was default. So if you even want to play a game like Outlast 1, any kind of horror game that's as intense as it, for almost 5 freaking hours, that's all up to you. Outlast is a horror game, so I'm not sure how long a person wants to play a game as scary as Outlast, but you can get almost 5 hours with this game, probably a full 5 hours if you set the game settings to medium or even low, or possibly if you turn down the resolution to 720p. Now, respectively, the next game has to be Outlast 2. Unfortunately, this game did not include DLC, not sure why the hell not. But anyway, at 1080p, 60 FPS, you can get 3 hours and 20 minutes with Outlast 2 on high settings, and again, everything else default. But that makes me think, would I want to play a game as advanced as Outlast 2 for more than 3 hours? Probably not. Now, don't get me wrong, I love these games, but after a while, you just kind of get tired of being scary. So 3 hours for 2 games as scary as these is kind of ridiculous. Now, the next game on the list is Sniper Elite 4. At 1080p 30 FPS, I managed to get 2 hours and 40 minutes with this game, and that's with medium settings, motion blur turned off, and draw distance at low. Now, even with those settings and tweaks to this title, at 1080p, this game doesn't play as good as I wanted it to. So setting it to 720p medium settings, with of course the draw distance set to low and motion blur off, you'll get a good 3 hours out of Sniper Elite 4. And for the most part, this game isn't really that remarkable on silent mode on the ROG Ally, so I guess this is one of the finer examples that silent mode still needs to be tweaked a little more. Because playing a game as precise as a Sniper Elite game at any FPS lower than 60 is kind of cringe in my opinion. It's kind of like the Nintendo Switch version. That was in 30 FPS 720p. But I do recommend playing Sniper Elite 4 in performance mode. You get a solid 2 hours or maybe even an hour and 45 minutes, and the FPS can easily reach 60 at 1080p. Now, the next and last game is one of my favorites. It's a game I've been tinkering with for the past 2 years, and for the most part, I've been trying to get an offline version of Ghost Recon Wildlands because I hate signing into Ubisoft launcher in order to play something that I bought on Steam. And Wildlands is a little tricky. At 1080p 30 FPS, you get 2 hours and 40 minutes, but that's with low settings. So I don't really recommend playing this game if you have to set it to 1080p at low settings. If you're gonna go to 1080p medium or high settings, look so much better. So I do recommend playing this game if you're going to go to 1080p in performance mode. But if you somehow need to save a lot of battery, I do recommend going to 720p medium settings, because if you set it to medium, the game will look a lot better. You can see a lot more important details that you would if you just take away everything in low settings. Now, I couldn't help but turn on the shadows when I set it to low at 1080p, because in low settings, all the shadows are just gone. But at 720p 30 FPS, you'll get about 3 hours with this title. So it's not too bad, but honestly, this is also one of the games that I would recommend playing in performance mode and not in silent mode just yet. There doesn't seem to be any sure way to make Wildlands last a long time and look just as good as the console version. For now, performance or even turbo are the best options for Wildlands if you want to play it the most optimal way. But yeah, there will be games that I run into that just aren't serviceable in silent mode, like Wildlands and Sniper Elite 4. Those games are a lot more graphically intensive, so you're not going to have as much luck with games that require you to be precise. But yeah, if there are any other games you want me to check out to see what the best power saver and performance options are, let me know in the comments. But yeah, there are a lot more power saver and performance guides coming for the ROG Ally that I have in the works right now, and I'm really not quite sure why a lot of other people don't do these kind of lists. Maybe it's because they don't want to get sued by me, but I don't really care. If you come out with a good power saver and performance guide, that'll help me as well as everyone else. I'm making these to more help myself to keep a list online forever, and of course in my notes, so I know which games work best with the ROG Ally, especially if I'm in some kind of situation like being at an airport. If I'm stuck somewhere without an outlet, I would want to know what the most recommended settings, power modes, and just overall options are to play the longest amount of time on my ROG Ally with my favorite titles. Welcome to the ROG Ally Power Saver and Performance Guide 3. And before we get started with everything on this list, just a little warning. If you're experiencing any performance degradation or crashing with your ROG Ally after setting your performance settings to any profiles mentioned in this video or any other performance guide, immediately set your ROG Ally to one of the default performance profiles provided by ASUS themselves. And thank you in advance. Now, first and foremost, there are things you have to do before starting to game on your ROG Ally. A lot of people say they need to update one software or another or Windows, but one of the first things I did was download the AMD software app. And in order to get the best battery life and performance, I advise that you download this app right now, because we're about to get into some graphical settings that can help you and your Ally's performance to play as well as possible for as long as possible. So the first thing you need to do is go to graphics settings and turn on anti-lag and image sharpening. But most importantly, switch Radeon Super Resolution to on, because without this switch turned on, RSR is just not going to work for most titles. And to get the most high quality image at 720p if you want to play in that resolution. Next, set your global profile to gaming. If all you're doing on your ROG Ally is gaming, this profile will focus the GPU and CPU on games specifically when you launch them. So you won't even have to go into Armory Crate in order to have some kind of focus mode with your ROG Ally. You can just go to the file, and because it's set to gaming profile, whenever you go back to, say, your desktop or any kind of folder to see any kind of information, your ROG Ally will automatically go into power saver mode. So you'll barely waste any kind of battery going back into other apps other than gaming mode. And it will focus on the game specifically and put every other app into the back seat. And also in this video, I'm going to show you how to adjust your TDP manually on your ROG Ally. And the first profile I'm going to show you, I nicknamed Power Saver Plus. This profile focuses on performance and battery. So unlike silent mode, you're going to get a lot more FPS for relatively, if not identical, battery life. And to make the Power Saver Plus profile, just press the Armory Crate button, go into your settings, operating mode, and in operating mode, select manual. Now scroll down to SPL, set that to 11 watts. Next, go to SPPT, set that to 15 watts, and that'll be kind of your maximum wattage if the game isn't playing as intended. But for the most part, you will be set to 11 watts in most instances. And then set FPPT to 20 watts. And next up, we need to make sure the fan speed is enough not to waste too much energy and bring your overall APU watts too high, but to a normal level to save as much battery as if you were using silent mode, or an in-between of silent mode and performance. But these fan settings will keep your ROG Ally nice and cool for the most part, and we'll have it most of the time at 69 degrees Celsius. So with the fan speeds, you're going to see a couple points in the scale. Don't touch the first 3 points in the fan scale. Make sure the 4th point in fan number 1 is set to 74% at 69 degrees. So when it does reach 69 degrees, that's when the left fan will ramp up to 74%. You can't lower it from 74% to anything else because of the SD card issues and the thermal states that ASUS has addressed. So they pretty much stick it to 74%. And once you set that 4th point to that degree and percentage, you can move the other points over to make more room for the 4th one. It doesn't really matter which point comes after the 4th one, because all you need to know is that the fan is going to ramp up at 74% no matter what after it passes 69 degrees Celsius. And yes, this may sound a little complicated to maybe if a kid is watching, but I'll provide some images and examples if this sounds a little too complicated. Now, with fan number 2, set that to 45% at 69 degrees Celsius. It's relatively going to activate at the same time as fan number 1, and that's exactly what you want. You want both fans to run as low as they possibly can while letting your system go to the temperature that's the most safe. Constantly blowing air on a CPU while it's in a safe temperature doesn't really affect anything. All it does is waste a lot more battery. And after setting fan number 1 and number 2 to their designated degrees and percentages, just another warning again, if you do experience crashing or performance degradation with these settings on your ROG Ally specifically, just return to normal silent mode, because I'm going to provide settings for both silent mode and Power Saver Plus mode as well. And the best part about this profile is that it runs at almost the exact wattage as silent mode, but there's no audio crackling and the performance is improved almost twofold. Just saying, I'm available if you need me, ASUS. And if you use silent mode and need to know how to disable the audio crackling, I provided a tutorial on how to disable it in the last Power Saver and performance guide for the ROG Ally, and that would be performance guide number 2. And lastly, when setting your ROG Ally to Power Saver Plus mode, as I call it, limiting your FPS to 45 will help smooth the frame rate, since that specific 11 watt setting can fluctuate the frame rate quite a bit. Limiting the FPS helps a great deal to smooth your experience out, with VRR helping as well. And besides Power Saver Plus mode, there is another profile that I'm introducing today, and I call it, for now, Performance Minus. This is for slightly more demanding titles, but to make sure your TDP limit is set to 18, because in performance mode, with some demanding titles, the ROG Ally automatically starts going to 20 watts, and that could put a damper on your battery life, especially if your temperature starts to rise and your fans start to ramp up. All that in tangent could give you about 20% less battery life overall. But with Performance Minus mode, you can limit your TDP to 18. And in order to do this, once again, go to SPL, limit that to 18 watts, and limit SPPT to 18 as well. Also limit FPPT to 18 and keep the fan speed at 75% at 69 degrees Celsius for fan number 1 and 45% for 69 degrees Celsius for fan number 2, just like with the first profile I showed you. And with all of that said and done, let's test out these profiles with some demanding and not so demanding titles. So the first game I tested is Batman Arkham Origins. That netted me 3 hours and 40 minutes on silent mode. And in case you don't know how many watts silent mode has, it has 10 watts. But sometimes it fluctuates to 9. And I managed to get that battery life at 1080p, 30 to 35 FPS. And that's with default settings. Now, I wouldn't recommend silent mode for Batman Arkham Origins, so we're going to try Power Saver Plus mode, which has 11 watts TDP. And with Power Saver Plus mode, I managed to get 3 hours and 20 minutes at 1080p with the frame rate between 40 to 50 FPS, and that's with default settings. And as you can see, it's a much greater performance increase with only 1 more watt added. And the next title I tried was Detroit Become Human. Now this is one of the most demanding titles on the PC platform, let alone an ROG Ally. And I managed to get 1 hour and 40 minutes in performance mode. And of course, performance mode usually lasts 1 hour and 40 to 45, so you can just assume you get 1 hour and 40 to 1 hour and 45 minutes in performance mode with Detroit Become Human. And that's with 720p 30 FPS lock in game settings. And make sure to turn on Fidelity FX, sharpening, and keep your settings in medium in general. Now, I switched the ROG Ally's profile to performance minus mode. And once again, this profile sets the ROG Ally to 18 watts TDP in total. And you can get 2 hours and 10 minutes with the same exact settings. And that is 720p 30 FPS. So you get almost the same exact performance with some dips in more taxing locations, like that street location at the beginning of the game. Usually the more taxing locations in this game are in the beginning, opposed to faster paced set pieces later in the game. And if you want the game to look almost identical to 1080p, you can turn on RSR and sharpen the image even further with AMD RIS. I tried comparing 1080p and 720p on my ROG Ally handheld mode with all the same exact settings turned on. And with both performance and performance minus mode, I saw very little difference in terms of image quality and performance. And just make sure you have that RSR option turned on in the AMD software app. Now, the next game I tested was Batman Arkham Asylum, and I managed to get 3 hours and 20 minutes at 1080p 60 FPS, and that's in silent mode, default settings. And for titles like these, Power Saver Plus isn't really needed because Arkham Asylum is an older game, so it runs great on silent mode anyway. Now, the following game I tested was Batman Arkham City, the sequel to Arkham Asylum, if you didn't know. And I managed to get the same thing, 3 hours and 20 minutes, but at 1080p 45 FPS lock on silent mode. And for the most part, you will be reaching 40 to 45 FPS in Arkham City, specifically in silent mode. And that's with default settings. Now with Power Saver Plus mode, you can get a steady 60 FPS at 1080p with the battery lasting about 2 hours and 55 minutes. If you have your Wi-Fi and Bluetooth set off with brightness to 50%, you could probably squeeze out another 5 to 10 minutes, which will net you 3 hours in total. With Batman Arkham City at 1080p 60 FPS in Power Saver Plus mode. And the last title I tried was, of course, Batman Arkham Knight. I managed to get 2 hours and 25 minutes at 1080p 30 FPS with performance minus mode. And at 720p 30 FPS in silent mode, I got 3 hours and 20 minutes with Batman Arkham Knight. And of course, if you want your image quality to stay the same or relatively the same, make sure you enable RSR and AMD RIS. Now, the last test I conducted on Batman Arkham Knight was with Power Saver Plus mode. At 720p, you can get upwards of 45 FPS with 3 hours of battery life. And Arkham Knight, if you have your spatial sound enabled, is one of those titles that will have audio crackling. So if you don't want audio crackling, again, I provided the tutorial in the last video, but you're going to have to disable spatial sound. But with Power Saver Plus mode at 720p with 45 FPS and more, you get 3 hours with absolutely zero audio crackling. Not sure what it is about 10 watts and lower that makes the spatial sound freak out, but with 11 watts, you'll get a good amount of time with this title at a reasonable resolution and frame rate. But yeah, that was the last game I tested on this list. Even though the former instructions were a lot to handle, I thought at least providing 5 games to test out these new profiles that I introduced to you today and comparing them to ASUS's default profiles would prove to be overall beneficial to everybody. What is going on, everybody? And welcome back to the ROG Ally's Power Saver and Performance Guide. Today, just to celebrate the new Grand Theft Auto 6, I thought I'd focus on most of the Grand Theft Auto games that you can play in the ROG Ally through Steam. And it has been almost 2 months since the last Power Saver and Performance Guide, so I figured why not do an entire series, especially the likes of Grand Theft Auto. And this series has been going around for a long time, from the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and even the PSP and Nintendo DS. But it seems the only thing I can't say about Grand Theft Auto, there hasn't been a console that officially had all of the Grand Theft Auto games. And I'm talking from 1, the PSP games, to 5. So you can play all the Grand Theft Auto games on PC, of course you can, but not officially. You'd have to get other means in order to play all of them. So for today, for legal reasons, I'm just going to focus on the official Steam versions of Grand Theft Auto. And for relevance sake, with the original Grand Theft Auto games, I'm going to be testing the remastered versions. And in order to test all of these games, I disabled CPU boost and I set the GPU VRAM to 6 gigabytes. And differentiating from the last Power Saver guide, with certain titles, I'm going to go even lower than 10 watts. And if you need to know exactly how I set custom watts to the ROG Ally, I will give a tutorial very soon on that. But for now, let's focus on Grand Theft Auto. So let's start with the oldest title, but it is still remastered. That is Grand Theft Auto 3. Now, because it is remastered, there are a lot of new assets in the game that will push the system in order to run it smoothly. And I managed to get 2 hours and 40 minutes with Grand Theft Auto 3 Remastered. I set the TDP to 11 watts, and with that at 1080p medium settings, I managed to get 30 FPS. Now with Grand Theft Auto 3, it's not really a super fast-paced, next-level sort of action game. Most of the time, you will have auto-aim during it. So 30 FPS is good enough, especially if you're getting 1080p with medium settings. You're going to focus more on the aesthetic of the game opposed to the performance. But if you want better performance and you don't care about the aesthetic, going 720p with an average 40 FPS with about the same battery life of 2 hours and 40 minutes will most likely satisfy people that want more performance over aesthetic. And the next runner-up is Grand Theft Auto Vice City Remastered. I got 2 hours and 30 minutes with this title at 10 watts silent mode. And with 1080p medium settings, again, I got 30 FPS out of this title. And if you want to get slightly more battery life with 2 hours and 40 minutes, you can set the resolution to 720p. And in some instances, you could set it to 900p and get 35 to 40 FPS, depending if it's 720p or 900p. And again, I usually stick to 30 FPS because a lot of the gameplay is not that intense and doesn't really require too much focus. Like with Grand Theft Auto 5, you can even have a first-person mode with more accurate aiming, so you do need the higher FPS. But we'll get to that bridge when we cross it. And the next Grand Theft Auto title I tested was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Remastered. And I managed to get, again, 2 hours and 30 minutes at 10 watts silent mode. And with 1080p default settings, I managed to get 30 FPS. But again, at 720p, you can get 40 FPS, or 900p, you can get 35 FPS. So if you want the frames to be a little higher, then you could set the resolution lower. And you get around 5 to 10 more minutes of battery life with lower resolution settings. And of course, all of these remastered titles had issues when they first released. But I played a good amount of all 3 titles. And for the most part, they don't really have those glitches that they did day one. I mean, I would expect them not to because it has been about a year and change. It would be more surprising if they didn't get rid of some of these issues, or at least most of them. But yeah, for the most part, all these Grand Theft Auto remastered titles do play extremely well for the resolution I set them at. And the next title on the list, and certainly not the least, we have Grand Theft Auto 4. And this is a game that's given me a certain amount of issues on the Steam Deck and really any PC I tried on. There are a certain amount of language issues and resolution issues I had to get past. But if you manage to do the research and get it to work with the ROG Ally, you'll end up getting about 3 hours of battery life with Grand Theft Auto 4. And I set the TDP to 9 watts, and with 1080p medium settings, I managed to get 30 to 40 40 FPS. Now, I find that to be an achievement all on its own. The fact that it's 1080p and gets 30 to 40 FPS at 9 watts. I set the wattage slightly lower than silent mode and still got 30 to 40 FPS at 1080p. Now, I find GTA 4, when it is working, to be one of the most impressive titles to play on the ROG Ally, hands down. And if you tweak it enough, it works very well. And now let's get to the main event. That is the legendary Grand Theft Auto 5. I remember the first time Grand Theft Auto 5 was announced, everybody was going ballistic. And I couldn't really understand the hype because I wasn't a big fan of open world games, and I never really finished any of the Grand Theft Autos, but I have played them with friends, like taking turns to see which one of us will get caught by the police in less time, or how long it takes to get caught by the police until we have to pass the controller. So with Grand Theft Auto 5 coming out, I was looking forward to those days again. And with the ROG Ally, Grand Theft Auto 5 lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes, and I set the TDP to 10 watts silent mode, and with 1080p default settings, I managed to get a solid 30 FPS. And default settings is everything set to normal and medium. Nothing set to high, otherwise it might dip to the high 20s or even mid 20s in some scenarios. But I tested numerous settings with Grand Theft Auto 5. The first was default settings, like I mentioned before. And the next is high settings, but specifically with 720p. And I set the TDP to 8 watts. Now, that's the lowest recommended wattage if you want to get some kind of solid performance outside of emulation. And with 720p high settings, the game looks phenomenal. But of course, it looks the best in 1080p. But with 720p high settings, I got 30 FPS. And it was a pretty solid 30 FPS. And the battery lasted 2 hours and 50 minutes. So the settings are high, but the battery life is higher. And if you want to mix it up a little more, I tried 900p and set the TDP to 11 watts. And with that, I got 40 to 45 FPS on average. And the battery life was 2 hours and 20 minutes. So the least amount of battery life, and the settings were default. So you can crank up that TDP a little more for about 10 to 30 minutes less battery life for a higher resolution and higher FPS. So yeah, it's still an achievement that I was able to get 3 hours with Grand Theft Auto 4. That's a PlayStation 3 game, and it still looks amazing on PC. But with Grand Theft Auto 5, you could probably get 3 hours if you put all the settings to low and limit the FPS to 30 with 720p. But all in all, the ROG Ally is an incredible device, and I have tested every single Grand Theft Auto game on it, albeit emulators or official Steam games, and they all work exceptionally well, even with lower TDP like 8 watts. And I just can't wait for everybody to try Grand Theft Auto on the ROG Ally. It's such an incredible device, and you can get the standard high definition resolution of 1080p. And honestly, these Grand Theft Auto games look spectacular in 1080p with medium to high settings. But of course, you can always crank your TDP up to turbo, and you could pretty much do whatever the hell you want with these titles. But I just can't wait for Grand Theft Auto 6. And throughout my time awaiting this year and for the upcoming New Year's, I'm going to be playing all these games on a plane and on the go and having an absolute freaking blast. But yeah, if you have any questions about how I installed any of these games, I can elaborate more in the comments below. And if you want to know how I set custom TDP, I give a small tutorial in my last Power Saver and Performance Guide. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a good one. Later. But one of the first things I did was download the AMD software app. And in order to get the best battery life and performance, I advise that you download this app right now, because we're about to get into some graphical settings that can help you and your allies' performance to play as well as possible for as long as possible. So the first thing you need to do is go to graphics settings and turn on anti-lag and image sharpening. But most importantly, switch Radeon Super Resolution to on, because without this switch turned on, RSR is just not going to work for most titles. And to get the most high quality image at 720p if you want to play in that resolution. Next, set your global profile to gaming. If all you're doing on your ROG Ally is gaming, this profile will focus the GPU and CPU on games specifically when you launch them. So you won't even have to go into Armory Crate in order to have some kind of focus mode with your ROG Ally. You can just go to the file, and because it's set to gaming profile, whenever you go back to, say, your desktop or any kind of folder to see any kind of information, your ROG Ally will automatically go into Power Saver mode. So you'll barely waste any kind of battery going back into other apps other than gaming mode. And it will focus on the game specifically and put every other app into the back seat. And also in this video, I'm going to show you how to adjust your TDP manually on your ROG Ally. And the first profile I'm going to show you, I nicknamed Power Saver Plus. This profile focuses on performance and battery. So unlike silent mode, you're going to get a lot more FPS for relatively, if not identical, battery life. And to make the Power Saver Plus profile, just press the Armory Crate button, go into your settings, operating mode, and in operating mode, select manual. Now scroll down to SPL, set that to 11 watts. Next, go to SPPT, set that to 15 watts, and that'll be kind of your maximum wattage if the game isn't playing as intended. But for the most part, you will be set to 11 watts in most instances. And then set FPPT to 20 watts. And next up, we need to make sure the fan speed is enough not to waste too much energy and bring your overall APU watts too high, but to a normal level to save as much battery as if you were using silent mode, or an in-between of silent mode and performance. But these fan settings will keep your ROG Ally nice and cool for the most part, and we'll have it most of the time at 69 degrees Celsius. So with the fan speeds, you're going to see a couple points in the scale. Don't touch the first 3 points in the fan scale. Make sure the 4th point in fan number 1 is set to 74% at 69 degrees. So when it does reach 69 degrees, that's when the left fan will ramp up to 74%. You can't lower it from 74% to anything else because of the SD card issues and the thermal states that ASUS has addressed. So they pretty much stick it to 74%. And once you set that 4th point to that degree and percentage, you can move the other points over to make more room for the 4th one. It doesn't really matter which point comes after the 4th one, because all you need to know is that the fan is going to ramp up at 74% no matter what after it passes 69 degrees Celsius. And yes, this may sound a little complicated to maybe if a kid is watching, but I'll provide some images and examples if this sounds a little too complicated. Now, with fan number 2, set that to 45% at 69 degrees Celsius. It's relatively going to activate at the same time as fan number 1, and that's exactly what you want. You want both fans to run as low as they possibly can while letting your system go to the temperature that's the most safe. Constantly blowing air on a CPU while it's in a safe temperature doesn't really affect anything. All it does is waste a lot more battery. And after setting fan number 1 and number 2 to their designated degrees and percentages, just another warning again, if you do experience crashing or performance degradation with these settings on your ROG Ally specifically, just return to normal silent mode.
Welcome to the official ROG Ally Power Saver and Performance Guide 4. The last Power Saver and Performance Guide was mostly focusing on GTA games, and I feel like that's not what I usually do, but for the time and the subject matter, I thought it was appropriate, especially given recent announcements. But this time around, ASUS released brand new features to their amazing handheld, the ROG Ally, like the ability to finally turn off CPU boost, as well as Radeon Anti-Lag, Radeon Chill, which helps with battery life and temperature, and Radeon Boost, which helps with overall FPS smoothing. And I know a lot of people are talking about FSR 3.0, but I haven't implemented that into my ROG Ally just yet. I feel like that is sort of more on mod territory, and I want this Power Saver and Performance Guide to be straightforward. I don't want anybody to have to mod their system just to get good battery out of their ROG Ally. I want this to be an out-of-box experience, so the FSR 3.0, until it is more easily accessible, will have to wait on my side. And before testing these games, I made sure to set the brightness to 50% at most with Wi-Fi turned off if you're not playing a multiplayer game. And of course, if you're exclusively playing in handheld mode, Bluetooth is turned off as well. CPU boost was disabled, and for better battery life, Power Saver mode on Windows was enabled, and Radeon Chill was also enabled. Anti-lag and RSR will affect battery and FPS a little bit, so I don't recommend using those settings if you plan on saving the most battery. And in terms of CPU boost disabling, in order to get it to the command center, just make sure to set that to be more easily accessible on the main Armory Crate application itself.
And the last adjustment I made was setting spatial sound off in Windows's audio settings to prevent sound crackling, because we are going to go below 10 watts today. And in this part of the Power Saver and Performance Guide, I set the ROG Ally's TDP to 8 watts in certain instances. And I'm calling it, just for ad-lib's sake, Ultra Power Saver. Sometimes setting the ROG Ally to silent mode isn't enough to save the most power. The main benefit of VRR, when in lower TDP, will be smoothing random frame drops. And even if the frames go down to 24 FPS, VRR makes the gameplay smooth, and with certain titles the FPS may dip to that range in certain locations. But VRR is helpful as well. You can easily set your own TDP profile by pressing the Armory Crate button, going into settings and selecting operating mode. You'll see manual on the far right. Select that, and the lowest and highest TDP can be changed by switching around the SPL, SPPT, and FPPT options. For example, if you want the lowest TDP to be 7, set SPL to 7, and the rest being SPPT and FPPT to their lowest wattages, which is 15. Lastly, I set VRAM to 6 gigabytes in Armory Crate's GPU settings, just to make sure there's enough VRAM for most of the games I'm going to test, since they're relatively new, and there's enough RAM to make the gameplay nice and smooth. Now, if you're looking to play certain other titles, like say Callisto Protocol, you might want to set the GPU VRAM to 7 gigabytes opposed to 6. But let's move on to some new tests. The first game I tested was none other than Capcom's new fighter, Street Fighter 6. Street Fighter 6 managed to get 2 hours and 30 minutes. I set the TDP to 11 watts, and I managed to get 50 to 60 FPS average. The resolution was set to 720p with medium settings, and if you want, you can set it to low for better performance. With these settings and TDP levels, you can play Street Fighter 6 for a good amount of time without sacrificing performance or visuals. And Street Fighter 6 means a lot to me. For some reason, the game just already feels nostalgic. I can just see the breath of history impacted on this game. Just everything about it, from the characters and the style, look vintage. Even the new characters look very classic. I just love the style of Street Fighter 6, and I'm continuing to play it almost every week. And if you are going to play online, enabling Wi-Fi will shave off about 10 to even 20 minutes, since you are using more processing power and hardware in the ROG Ally. So you'll get around 2 hours and 10 minutes average if you're playing online matches. But usually online matches stream certain graphical aspects, so who knows, you might get more. And the next game I tested is one of my favorite racers. That is Forza Horizon 5. For some reason, Forza Horizon games work amazingly on the ROG Ally, even with low TDP settings. And it seems like this is a Windows specific thing. I really didn't have to adjust any settings to get Forza Horizon 5 to work great. And I managed to get around 3 hours with the 8 watt setting, aka Ultra Power Saver mode. And the FPS was around 30, and the resolution was set to 720p with medium settings. Now at 1080p mode with medium to high settings, and the ROG Ally set to silent mode, which is 10 watts, I managed to get around 2 hours and 30 minutes of gameplay with an average of 40 to 50 FPS. So there's a 30-minute sacrifice if you just use silent mode opposed to an 8 watt TDP mode, with a noticeable quality and performance difference. The ROG Ally definitely still has a ways to go in terms of low wattage performance. I agree with that. But with the CPU boost disabled, there is a significant battery boost, even with a game like Forza Horizon 5. And the next game is also one of my favorite racing games, but on the PS Vita. So it was very important to get this to work exceptionally well at suitable battery performance. And that game is none other than Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005. And I managed to get a whopping 3 hours and 20 minutes with this title. I absolutely just love playing this on the go. It is my go-to game on the ROG Ally, especially with its 900p resolution on default settings. And I set the TDP to 8 watts, and I managed to get an average 30 to 40 FPS with this title. And that is, of course, with medium motion blur, shadows, and ambient occlusion. Everything else was set to default. And Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005 is an amazing game that plays surprisingly well at a lower TDP with exceptional battery performance, if I do say so myself. And the next game I tested is a badass fighting game that's had sort of a niche following, and that is Grand Blue Fantasy, and I managed to get 3 hours with this title. Now, 3 hours seems to be a trend in this power and performance guide so far. I set the TDP to 8 watts, also known as Ultra Power Saver, and I managed to get an average average 60 FPS at 720p default settings. And of course, setting the TDP to silent mode, which is 10 watts, will enable you to set the resolution to 1080p for some 60 FPS gameplay. And with that setting, you can expect to see a 30-minute decrease in battery life. So you get around 2 hours and 50 minutes, which is still exceptional. And the final game I tested is sort of a strange one. Wait, let me rewrite that. It's an incredible game and I absolutely love it. And that title is none other than Deadpool. I managed to get 3 hours and 10 minutes. I set the TDP to 8 watts with 45 FPS average, and that's with 1080p resolution with default settings. Overall, Deadpool plays extremely well at low TDP. It's an Xbox 360 game, so it's not very surprising it lasts so long on battery and plays this well. And the trend of getting 3 hours in this addition to Power and Performance Guide could have only been done by disabling CPU boost and enabling Radeon Chill. And the entire time I tested all of these titles, the ROG Ally was running extremely silent. In fact, I doubt I even heard the fan once. And I can't wait to see which type of new features and tweaks ASUS comes up with next. But with the current state the ROG Ally is in, this handheld has proven my expectations wrong over and over again. And no matter how many people hate on it, it just keeps getting better. And if there are any more games you all want me to test, let me know because I have thousands in my backlog. But yeah, it was fun testing all of these games on the ROG Ally, and there's so much more to come. It's just been a busy holiday so far, and I hope you guys think of picking up some of these titles for your ROG Ally this season. What is going on, everybody? And welcome to the ROG Ally's Ultimate Power Saver and Performance Guide. Now, of course, before starting any of these tests, naturally, you're going to have to enable Radeon Chill and disable CPU boost to get that extra boost of battery life with each of these titles that we're testing today. And for me personally, with the ROG Ally, the most important factor about it is how many games it can play. If it can play most, if not all the games I throw at it, then I feel that's an accomplished handheld. But there are other people that believe battery life is more important for a handheld than how many games it can actually play. Now, I do agree with this to some extent, but we can, as two groups, meet in some kind of middle ground. And with my previous Power Saver and Performance Guide videos for the ROG Ally, I did provide a tutorial on exactly how to change your TDP wattage and basically just your power draw in your ROG Ally to get the maximum amount of battery life and also performance. I'm going to be providing the maximum battery life and which wattages and settings are best for that, and also which wattages and settings are best for the best performance with the best battery life, because I know there are people out there that just want a 1080p handheld device with all the bells and whistles displaying the absolute best quality with their Ally. And getting started, the first title is one of my favorites. It's a game that I've been playing for more than a decade, and that is DMC Devil May Cry. I managed to get a maximum of 3 hours and 30 minutes, and I set the TDP to 8 watts. Now somehow, setting this to 8 watts instead of 7 provides you with an extra 10 FPS boost. And I know it's because of the Z1 Extreme CPU inside that doesn't allow the TDP to be too low. But at 8 watts, you can set the resolution to 1080p with ultra settings. And in most cases, you'll get 35 to 45 FPS, which is magnificent because this game will last 3 hours and 30 minutes, and that's with 1080p. Now, with 720p, you can probably get close to 4 hours. But of course, to each his own when it comes to resolution. I prefer DMC Devil May Cry at 1080p because it looks absolutely incredible, even by today's standards. DMC Devil May Cry still holds up. But with that said, moving on to the next game. This is a title that has been giving some people trouble, and this game is Burnout Paradise. If you want to play Burnout Paradise without any crashes, pun not intended, because every time you crash in this game, the game crashes as well, which I find kind of ironic, but also that puts a little more on the line while you're racing. But of course, with Burnout, you're going to crash a lot. So in order to not get this game to crash whenever you do crash in-game, simply disable Steam Overlay. And if that doesn't work, make sure to turn off the webcam setting in the game settings, as well as the graphic settings to medium, if disabling Steam Overlay doesn't work for for you. But if that does work for you, you'll be able to play Burnout Paradise for 4 hours at 8-watt TDP with the resolution set to 1080p at high settings. And you'll be able to get 45 to 60 FPS with Burnout Paradise. Now there you go. You got the fix for Burnout Paradise that for some reason people didn't see online but instead decided to post it on YouTube. I'm pretty sure they eventually found the answer to that. But if you didn't know how to fix Burnout Paradise, there's your fix. And the next game is a game that I talked about recently, and that is the Callisto Protocol. I've been playing this game to death, and I managed to get a maximum of 2 hours and 30 minutes, somehow with the TDP set to 18 watts. I'm not sure how that gives me more battery life than 15 watts. Actually, I know exactly how it does. The other settings with the TDP prevent the Ally from going into the 20 watt range like 15 watt or performance mode does. So if you set it to 18 watts, with the maximum being 18 watts, you'll actually save a lot of battery opposed to actual performance mode. And that's why I call this performance minus mode, because it is, as the title says it is, it's like performance mode with slightly less wattage at certain instances. But you'll get more steady performance because the TDP isn't fluctuating between 15 and 20. So I do think that setting it to 18 does provide a smoother experience with Callisto Protocol. And the resolution was set to 900p at all times, because setting it to 1080p can look incredible in certain environments, but performance-wise, it's just not acceptable in most. And the settings were surprisingly set to high. If you want to set the settings to medium and make the game kind of look like how it does with the Steam Deck, then you can do that. But if you want to get the full resolution and just the full experience with every detail in this game, then you're going to want to set the graphic settings to high. And with everything, the FPS fluctuated from 30 to 50. But I find in most places, the FPS is 35 to 50, especially if you set your TDP to 18 watts. And the next title on the list is a game that countless people have been talking about, and that is none other than Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now, Resident Evil 4 Remake is optimized extremely well, especially at this point post-launch. So I actually managed to get 3 hours with Resident Evil 4 Remake, and that's with setting the TDP to 11 watts, high settings, and the resolution at 900p, and with FSR2 set to quality. And for the most part, I managed to get the FPS to hover around 40 to 45 average. But if you want to play with higher quality and with enough battery, by setting the TDP to 14 watts, you'll get around 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that is at the resolution of 1080p with high settings and FSR set to balanced. And you'll actually get 60 FPS out of this. In most locations, I'd say from 50 to 60 FPS with these settings. But if you want to get the maximum amount of battery with Resident Evil 4 Remake, I managed to get 4 hours with 9 watts, low settings, and the resolution set to 720p, and the FSR set to performance mode. And you'll get an average of 40 FPS with these settings. Now, I think playing Resident Evil 4 Remake for 4 hours is a big deal, especially on a handheld, and a handheld that is a Windows handheld nonetheless. So with that accomplishment in mind, let's move on to a slightly less high-profile game. And that game is oddly Dark Sector. Now with this game, I easily managed to get 4 hours with the TDP set to the minimum 7 watts, with a resolution set to 1080p with max settings, and I managed to get 45 to 60 FPS on average with Dark Sector. Now, I love this title. It was the Resident Evil 4 after Resident Evil 4, strangely enough. It took everything that Resident Evil 4 was and just made it look prettier with different kinds of biological weapons. In fact, there's one biological weapon that's attached to your arm, which gives you the ability of summoning a glaive, which is this humongous boomerang-like blade that you can throw at people, charge, and just combine elemental abilities with. Dark Sector is an exceptional game that was overshadowed by the older title, Resident Evil 4 Original. Even though it came out after, Dark Sector was a game that has been in development for so long, and it ended up becoming a game called Warframe that I'm sure a lot of you know, but it's kind of the original Warframe. And apparently they're making another single-player Warframe-like game that has some attributes similar to Dark Sector, which I can't wait for. But yeah, if you haven't checked out Dark Sector already, you can play it for 4 hours on the ROG Ally without any kind of compromises. And the last game on the list was a huge surprise when it was announced a couple years back. And I'm still not over the fact that Devil May Cry 5 has released officially, and it gave everybody the badass Demon Slayer that they they all wanted. The one-liners, even if he stabbed right in the face. And the best female characters of any video game. Dante's mom, oddly clad with skimpy clothes. And a girl called Lady, so basically a girl called Girl. But somehow, this is better than DMC Devil May Cry, and having Dante look accurate to the people that actually play him. I'll stop. With Devil May Cry 5, I managed to get 3 hours and 30 minutes. And yes, you heard that right. All you have to do is set the TDP to 8 watts, with most graphical settings in-game set to high, but specifically the rendering mode set to interlaced. Now the game doesn't look all that different. Maybe their hair will look slightly choppier if you look very close. But besides that, the game basically looks the same with a 30% performance boost if you set the rendering mode to interlaced. Now, a lot of people somehow don't know about this option, but I found this out early when I was trying to play Resident Evil 2 Remake with my 1080p laptop. Interlaced is a lifesaver. But of course, you're setting the TDP to 8 watts, so interlaced won't exactly be enough if you want to reach those high FPSs. You'll have to set the resolution to 720p. And with that, you'll get around 40 to 55 FPS, which is enough for a third-person action title like Devil May Cry. Even 40 FPS is enough for this game, but you'll manage to get 55. If you want to limit the FPS, you can do so by turning on the FPS limiter in Command Center, and you can limit it to a minimum of 30, or you can even boost it up to 45 to get that extra bit of smoothness in your gameplay. But of course, that's the maximum amount of battery you can get with Devil May Cry 5 on the ROG Ally, with the maximum amount of FPS included. If you set the TDP to 11 watts with high settings, and of course the rendering mode turned to interlaced, with the resolution set to 1080p, you can actually get a maximum of 2 hours and 45 minutes with Devil May Cry 5. And in most cases, you'll get an FPS of around 40 to even 55, just like with the last settings, but with a lot higher resolution thrown into the mix. But yeah, there are so many power saver and performance guides that I'm going to be working on in the future, but that's specifically all for this list today. Now, if you have any other games you want me to test, let me know in the comments below. And because I've been working on different types of videos, specifically for the ROG Ally, I wasn't able to test as many games as I wanted to, but hopefully the games I provided and the settings I provided are enough for you for now. So here we are back again with an ROG Ally Power Saver guide, but this time, this is the ROG Ally Maximum Power Saver guide, specifically for the battery life. This guide is going to focus on battery life, no matter what the cost will be. And that means quality, brightness, and even features that are primarily used for the ROG Ally to amplify your experience. There will be certain things that are disabled that are specifically made to give you the most battery life possible in your most dire situation. So that means if you're on an airplane or a long bus ride or even a long train ride, this is the guide that you're going to want to follow to get the best and absolute maximum battery life for your ROG Ally. And before anything else, you're going to want to set your ROG Ally's resolution to 720p through Command Center. And yes, that means that every game on this guide is going to be running at 720p. And the main dividing factor of this guide is the fact that we're not going to go above 720p ever. This is specifically the maximum battery life that you can get on the ROG Ally. And with some of these games, I have actually tested them for about 10 hours to get the best and longest battery life with these AAA titles. And along with setting your resolution to 720p on Armory Crate and Command Center, you're going to want to turn off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi because those take a lot of power as well. Wi-Fi consistently searches for different connections and networks to connect to, I'm pretty sure every 2 minutes or so. So it's going to take a lot of battery life out of your system. And if you have one of those live wallpapers, you're probably going to want to turn that off or switch to a static wallpaper so that the CPU and RAM aren't being used while you're already using it for your AAA games. And through Windows, you're going to want to turn on Power Saver mode because that's going to limit your RAM, CPU, and eGPU usage as well as your brightness. And of course, disable CPU boost because that takes a ton of energy and we're not going to need that for the games that I'm going to list off today at least. And we're most likely never going to need CPU boost because that takes way too much battery. And of course, enable Radeon Chill in the GPU settings in Armory Crate. And even though it's probably not recommended, but for all of these games tested, I enabled 120 Hz mode on the ROG Ally so I can get that sweet VRR. With all of these games, VSync is disabled. And if your brightness hasn't adjusted to the appropriate level after setting Power Saver on, just put your brightness to 50% by default, at the very most. I think 50% is the best, especially if you're in a car or anywhere else just waiting for a very long time. But if even after setting it to 70%, you're still having some issues seeing your game on your ROG Ally, then I recommend getting an anti-UV screen protector like I did. But yes, let's get started with this maximum power saver guide for the ROG Ally. And the first game is Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, of course. And I managed to get 4 hours and 10 minutes with this title. So that is Nintendo Switch level battery life with a game like Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. And of course, I set the graphic level in order to make the game look as good as possible with as much battery life as possible with a consistent 30 FPS. But before anything, I set the TDP to 7 watts. And yes, that is the minimum amount of wattage that you can set on your ROG Ally. So all you have to do is go to Command Center, switch your TDP usage to manual, and set everything to the lowest TDP. Now, with 7 watts, you might drop in frames by about 2 to 3. So you might be seeing frames of 27 FPS. If you want an absolute steady 30 FPS, I do recommend setting your TDP to 8. But in most instances, it's a lot more impressive if you set it to the minimum TDP, and you'll get about 20 more minutes of battery life. But with 8 watts, I managed to get 4, and with 7 watts, I managed to get 4 hours and 10 minutes plus. So if the 10 minutes aren't worth a frame rate that isn't a steady 30, then you might want to switch over to 8 watts. And now let's get into the graphics settings, and this is where everything counts. I set the resolution windowed mode to borderless full screen, and I set the resolution in total to 1024 by 576, and I locked the frame rate to 30 FPS, set all settings to either medium or high, and depending on how much detail you would like to be displayed, if you set the graphic settings to medium, then you could set the TDP to 7 watts. But if you use high settings like I did, then in order to get a consistent 30 FPS, the TDP will need to be set to 8 watts. And out of everything, I wasn't using the official Steam version of Metal Gear Solid: The Phantom Pain. I was using a third-party version, because sometimes Metal Gear Solid: The Phantom Pain requires an internet connection, and if you absolutely are in your most dire situation possible with battery life, location, and just entertainment, then you're most likely not going to want to use an official version that requires an internet connection every time you start the damn thing. So I personally used a third-party version, which enabled me to close Steam completely. And closing Steam for these third-party titles will lend you even more battery life for your time. But if you have to run Steam, try running Steam in big picture mode and closing every other application. But if you prefer to play Metal Gear Online, like those other 5 people in the comment section do, then using the Steam version would be your only option at that point. But going online and using Wi-Fi will inevitably use up battery life. And for the majority, I play Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain single player, offline mode, without Steam running, and it gave me that amount of battery life. As long as you buy the game, using a third-party version is fine. I don't recommend just getting third-party versions willy-nilly and never touching the Steam version. You gotta support the platform and the developers who made it, even if they are Konami. And moving on to the next game, and of course it is one of my favorite games of all time, and that is Resident Evil 2 Remake. I managed to get 4 hours with this title as well. I set the TDP to 7, set the resolution to 720p, the render mode in the graphic settings was set to interlaced, like it always is, but the frame rate was actually locked to 30 FPS, and all the settings were set to low. Like with the previous title, if you set the TDP to 8, that will give you freedom to higher up your graphic settings to medium with a consistent 30 FPS, but it'll give you a lot less battery life, say 20 minutes less. But of course, if you're using low graphic settings, and if you want a higher FPS to say 60, then uncapping that FPS and setting the TDP to 8 will help you out a lot. And of course, and naturally, playing Resident Evil 2 Remake for 4 hours on a handheld device such as the ROG Ally is an absolutely amazing time, and I highly recommend trying these settings and of course picking up Resident Evil 2 Remake, because even though it seems like it, I haven't mentioned this game enough. And the next title was a bit of a doozy, and that is Marvel's Avengers Definitive Edition. So this is the version of Marvel's Avengers with all of the DLC, with capped graphics updates, and just overall the best experience you can get with Marvel's Avengers if you like this game. So I managed to get 3 hours and 30 minutes with this title. I had to set the TDP to 9 because for some reason Marvel's Avengers uses a ton of CPU power, but I did not enable CPU boost. CPU boost is still disabled for this title, and I had to turn off FSR because it just looked too dang ugly at 720p, and I set the dynamic resolution to 30 FPS. So dynamic resolution is enabled for this game, and of course the FPS is limited to 30, but you have to actually limit it through Command Center because there is no actual limiter in Marvel's Avengers graphic settings. And I set all the graphic settings to their lowest possible points, all with the exception of lens flares and screen effects being left on, but everything else is off and at its lowest graphic setting. And obviously with 11 to 15 TDP, these games play worlds better. But the main focus of this test is to see exactly how low we can get the TDP with the best quality settings, even if they are at their lowest point, like with Avengers. So as far as Marvel's Avengers, it seems to be the only game on this list that uses a lot of CPU power, to the point even 8 watts wasn't enough to keep a steady FPS, even with dynamic resolution enabled along with FSR set to performance mode. So 9 watts was the definitive wattage to use with Marvel's Avengers Definitive Edition. And I'll probably cover this game in my Ultimate Power Saver guide at a different time. And like I said before, quality is not the focus, but it is something that you need in order to get immersed in the game. So these are just the best settings that I could possibly get while still maintaining Marvel's Avengers quality as well as its FPS. And the next game on the list is Dishonored 1. I managed to get 4 hours and 10 minutes with this title. I set the TDP to 7 and the resolution was set to 720p. The graphic settings were just kept at default because this is an Xbox 360 era game. It doesn't need any extra elbow grease in order to run it, but you have to make sure to turn the rat shadows off. For some reason there's a lot of rats in this game, similar to a Plague Tale, and you can either limit the FPS to 30 or it will fluctuate from 35 to 45 consistently, which is very annoying. Setting the FPS to 30 will enable it to become a lot more steady. And of course, setting it to 30 will save a lot of battery life as well. And moving on to the final game on the list, and that is of course Lies of P. Now I've been waiting for this game to arrive in certain forms for a long time. And surprisingly, with Lies of P, I managed to get 4 hours with this game. And the TDP was set to 7, which is the minimum. The resolution was set to 720p. For some reason, Lies of P works so dang good. It's one of the best Souls-like games that I've played in a long time because it's easy to grasp and it's optimized extremely well. And of course, the aesthetic and the storyline is absolutely amazing and I love it. The screen mode was set to maximum screen and the graphic settings were all set to low, with FSR set to balanced, with sharpening at 0.5, and fidelity CACAO was set to off because that seems to knock off 1 or 2 more FPS every second. And the max frame limit was set to unlimited. And of course, like with the rest of the games, VSync is turned off. And just a reminder, in Command Center, make sure to set the refresh rate to 120 Hz and the FPS limiter to 30. Now, Lies of P is an exceptional game, and playing it for 4 hours is way more than enough time to progress through the game enough to have an immersive and satisfying experience, just like with a Nintendo Switch. But with most of these titles, the quality of the games are a little better than a Nintendo Switch. But with this guide, I'm not scared to bring the quality down to Nintendo Switch levels in order to get the battery life that I desire, and that you rightfully deserve as a gamer and a supporter of the handheld. And these tests have proven that ROG Ally can have Switch-like battery along with Switch-like graphics or even better to help. And again, make sure your base resolution for your desktop is set to 720p. It will help with performance and overall battery life because every time you minimize your game or something like that, if you have your desktop set to 1080p, your ROG Ally will go back into 1080p whenever you do minimize your game. So just make sure to set everything to 720p for the best experience and the smoothest experience possible. And I do recommend setting the aspect ratio manually and not automatically because sometimes the games will not automatically automatically set your aspect ratio to 16:9. And for some reason that seems to confuse the ROG Ally when you minimize the game, even if you have your core resolution to 720p. And in some cases, it'll limit the resolution to the point you won't be able to see the rest of your ROG Ally screen. So with setting the internal resolution and the game's resolution to 720p, just make sure that you manually set the aspect ratio to 16:9 just to be safe. But it is awesome to know that all of these settings with the maximum battery life is just an option that you have in your most dire and needful times as a gamer, or if you simply just want to be entertained. If you want to ignore all of these settings and just play at 1080p, I have another guide for that. It's called the ROG Ally Ultimate Power Saver Guide. It does focus on higher resolution or resolution that is equivalent to 1080p if you can't get the appropriate battery life with said quality. And of course, if you just want to do whatever you want, you can, because you have the ROG Ally, which has a ton of power and all of those options readily available for you. I personally prefer to play with max resolution, and that's why it's taken me so long to make this specific guide, because I haven't been in any situation where I didn't bring a power bank to support my 1080p needs. But I realize that there are a lot of people that don't have those $80 to $100 power banks, and most likely don't want to carry around a power bank along with their ROG Ally, so I figured this is the best course of action and the best series and guide to introduce to those gamers.
So ASUS has been supporting their ROG Ally handheld a considerable amount, and even though the handheld from the start had a ton of potential, when you use these specific settings and set your Ally to its lowest power, that's somehow when you can really see the ROG Ally's potential. This handheld seems to have no compromises whatsoever, but when all else fails, it's completely possible to get the most out of the Ally's battery. And for some reason, that makes the device feel even more powerful. Its versatility is unmatched, in my opinion, in the handheld gaming space. And I really haven't seen any handheld in history blow me away as much as the ROG Ally, because as much as it can preserve energy, it can also go the opposite route and use as much power as possible to play pretty much any game under the sun. So without further ado, welcome back to the ROG Ally's Ultimate Power Saver and Performance Guide. And this particular one is number 6. And before getting into the list, as always, for frame smoothing and VRR, make sure to turn on Radeon Anti-Lag and Radeon Boost in Armory Crate's GPU settings, as well as setting the refresh rate to 120 Hz. And this will be applied to every game on the list. So make sure to turn off that VSync in order to take full advantage of VRR. Now, the first game on the list is pretty much my favorite racing game of all time. And if you are having trouble running Forza Horizon 3, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video exactly how to get that game working. Because there is a side list that I'm making for specific games that are a little harder to run on the ROG Ally than they should be. But for Forza Horizon 3, I managed to get 3 full hours at 8-watt TDP, 1080p, and at high settings, I managed to get 40 to 50 FPS on average. Forza Horizon 3 did show a bit of trouble, but pretty much all I did to get the game running properly is go to the AMD software app and just refresh your shader cache. And the only issue Forza Horizon 3 is having at 1080p is when you go into the car menu to buy new cars or customize your current ones. If you are going into the Horizon car show or car menu, all you have to do is put the resolution back to 720p, and then you could pretty much do whatever you want on that screen. But with 1080p, for some reason, there is a lot of graphical glitches in that specific menu. But the game looks fantastic at 1080p and plays very well at 8 TDP on the ROG Ally. So you'll be able to play for probably more than 3 hours, but I got 3 hours with it, mainly because I had the brightness set all the way up to 100%. And if you're not playing games online, I do recommend turning off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. If you do that, you will save an extra 20 minutes on your ROG Ally's battery. And the next game on the list is Metro Last Light. This is one of the more demanding titles, so you have to set your TDP to 9 watts. And I managed to get 40 to 50 FPS at 1080p high settings. And that netted me about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Now this may not seem like a lot, but this is the performance guide. So this is about how good you can make the game look with the most amount of battery you can save. And 2 hours and 40 minutes playing with 1080p at 40 to 50 FPS at high settings, well, that just feels like a whole lot of battery. And Metro Last Light is one of the better looking games on PC. And of course, this specific version is the Redux version, so it has that ray tracing setting that you can't turn off. But with the original Metro games, the non-Redux version plays a lot worse, even though they don't force ray tracing on you. And since I covered Metro 2033 in another Power Saver and Performance Guide video, the next game on the list is, evidently, Metro Exodus. I managed to play at silent mode, 720p, 45 to 50 FPS at high settings for 2 hours and 30 minutes. Now, a lot of you might not want to play a game like Metro Exodus at 720p if you're playing with a powerhouse handheld like the ROG Ally. So there's another setting that I would permit changing it to, which is 11 watt TDP at 1080p, and that gives you about 30 to 35 FPS at high settings. And with these settings, I managed to get 2 hours and 25 minutes. Now, Metro Exodus isn't exactly the most high octane, fast-paced FPS you can play on the ROG Ally, so this game is mainly about aesthetic and stealth. So 30 to 35 FPS is just about fine for the kind of experience Metro Exodus gives you. Now, there is an open world aspect, and that's why the 11 watt TDP is important. In smaller locations, you'll get about 40 FPS, but for the most part and the main run, which is an open world, you'll get 30 to 35. And there's a good number of games on this list, so we'll just move on. The next game on the list is one of my favorites, and it's a game I keep going back to, and that is Ninja Gaiden Sigma 1. I managed to play at 7 TDP at 1080p with a solid 60 FPS at high settings. And with those settings, I got 3 hours and 30 minutes with this title. And that's about the same amount of time you could get on the Nintendo Switch with this title, but the Nintendo Switch version is 720p in handheld mode. You're going to be playing Ninja Gaiden Sigma 1 at 1080p, and there's no other way to play it. The Ninja Gaiden games are just fantastic, and they look absolutely mesmerizing at 1080p. And you can even shrink the wattage down to 7 watts, and it'll still play at a solid 60 FPS for the most part. Maybe there's a little more lag there than there would be at a higher TDP, but this game isn't exactly demanding. Now, the next title on the list is, of course, Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. I also managed to set the TDP to 7 watts at 1080p with a solid 60 FPS at high settings, and I managed to get 3 hours and 30 minutes with Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. This is a more demanding title since the first Ninja Gaiden came out for the PlayStation 3, and this one came out for the original Xbox 360. And if you don't know, Ninja Gaiden Sigma is a remastered version of the original Ninja Gaiden, but it is rebuilt and remade from the ground up. And the next game on the list is episodically Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge. Now, this is the exact same story. I set the TDP to 7 watts, and the game's running at 1080p with a constant 60 FPS at high settings. Now, Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge is the latest game in the series, so it's going to require some tuning here and there. But for the most part, 7 TDP will give you a constant 60 FPS. Maybe you might have to set some of the settings to medium, like with anti-alias. And of course, with this title, like with the rest of the Ninja Gaiden games, I managed to get 3 hours and 30 minutes. And to me personally, Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge is one of the more impressive titles in the series because it just pushes everything to 11, including all of the challenges, so you'll be able to play an insane amount of content on the go with one of the most impressive action games to date. There are ways to play the original Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 games, and to me, Ninja Gaiden 2 Original for the Xbox 360 is the best Ninja Gaiden game. But for right now, with the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection, Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge, to me, is the best out of the trilogy. And the next title on the list is one of my other favorite racing games that I played this year and last, and that still continues to amaze me till this day, especially with the performance you can get and the resolution you can achieve on the ROG Ally. And that game is Need for Speed Heat. Need for Speed Heat is one of the most impressive Need for Speed games that you can play currently. I think it's better than Unbounded and some of the other titles that came out in the past 10 years. But on the ROG Ally, you can play Need for Speed Heat at 900p with 11 watt TDP, and you could get a pretty steady 30 to 35 FPS at high settings. And Need for Speed Heat lasted me about 2 hours and 10 minutes. with these settings. And of course, this title is an open world racing game similar to Forza Horizon, but somewhat not in the scale that Forza Horizon is at, because you don't really go to any countrysides in this one. That's more payback speed, and it's still kind of a desert location in payback. But with Need for Speed Heat, your primary location is the cityscape, so you won't be going anywhere too extravagant, so keeping a steady 30 to 35 FPS will be commonplace with this game. And the next title on the list is my favorite FPS because it has the nostalgia and the flair, and that is Doom 2016. And I surprisingly didn't cover this in previous performance and battery saver guides, but I managed to play Doom 2016 at 1080p 30 to 40 FPS in high settings with a mere 8-watt TDP, and that lasted me about 2 hours and 30 minutes. If you want to get slightly higher FPS with slightly higher battery, you can set the resolution down to 720p at the same wattage, but you'll manage to get 40 to 50 FPS at ultra settings. And with those settings, I managed to get 2 hours and 40 minutes, almost 3 hours. But I had Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned on, as well as the brightness set to 100%. So if you set the brightness to about 50 or even lower with the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned on, since most people don't play Doom 2016 online anymore, you could probably get 3 hours easily at 8 TDP. In fact, that's most likely the more common scenario that everyone's going to get with these specific settings. And yes, the list isn't over yet. The next game I tried and tested on the list is Mortal Kombat 11. With 11-watt TDP, I managed to play Mortal Kombat 11 at 1080p with a constant 60 FPS at high settings for 2 hours and 15 minutes. If you want to get a lot more time on your hands with Mortal Kombat 11, say if you're playing with friends or family, then you could set the TDP to 8 watts, the resolution to 900p, with the AIS sharpening in the command center options to make the game look like it's 1080p, with a constant 60 FPS at high settings. And with these settings, you'll get around 3 hours with Mortal Kombat 11. Now, for the Nintendo Switch, I put in about 35 hours with Mortal Kombat 11. So if you are playing this on the go with family or friends, you're most likely going to need a power bank anyway. But with high settings, Mortal Kombat 11 will look as intended. And with a constant 60 FPS, you're damn right it's going to play as intended as well. And the last game on the list is something you might not expect, but it is one of my favorite FPS games ever, and that is Call of Duty Black Ops 2. With this title, I set the TDP to 7 watts, and I managed to play the game at 1080p with around 40 to 50 FPS at high settings. And I got the most time out of this game, which is 3 hours and 45 minutes. And that's with constant action. If you know how Call of Duty Black Ops 2 begins, you'll know it's a constant war zone with a flurry of NPCs on the screen. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 is one of the most impressive games even till this day. And on the ROG Ally, you can play this game with a mere 7-watt TDP, and you can get almost 4 hours with this title at 1080p. Just that sentence alone I never expected to say, especially when it comes to modern handhelds. With the ROG Ally, there are 0 compromises, and you'll be able to play at a top resolution with a considerable amount of frames per second, as well as plenty of battery to go around. The ROG Ally continues to impress me every step of the way. Sure, I run into some issues with Windows here and there, but there isn't anything that I can run into that I can't solve in the same hour or even day. With the ROG Ally, since it is using Windows, there are countless workarounds to take advantage of, and limitless ways to play your games on the go with as much battery life and performance that you can possibly get. And welcome back to the ROG Ally's Ultimate Power Saver and Performance Guide number 7. And today we're going to go over a few important games, but more importantly, games that required more attention from me than they usually do. And that's in order to get the most power out of these titles while still looking comparable and collected. I want these titles to play at the highest resolution as possible while saving the most power as possible. And of course, before starting this list, make sure to enable Radeon anti-lag and boost, and of course set the refresh rate to 120 Hz, and make sure to turn VSync
off in every single graphic settings for every title on this list to enable VRR. And to get the most power for these games, because all of these games will be single player, make sure to disable Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for an extra around 20 to 25 minutes of gameplay. And that is a considerable amount, especially if you're in the car waiting for your fast food order to be done, or you're just waiting to pick somebody up and it's going to take an extra 30 minutes than you thought. Turning off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth will give you that extra time that you possibly need. But if you need Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or if you're playing a multiplayer game, I do advise obviously turning on Wi-Fi to do so. And also I set the GPU VRAM to 6 gigabytes for smoother performance and all the VRAM you need for the type of graphical settings we're going to have for each game on the list. And the first game on the list since the new Amazon show came out is Fallout 3. Now I managed to get 3 hours and 45 minutes with this title. I set the TDP to 8 watts, set the resolution to 1080p, and managed to get 70 to a whopping 120 FPS max at ultra settings. And the smoothness of 70 and 120 FPS wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the VRR, which is featured in the ROG Ally. And the way I was able to get smooth and high FPS with Fallout 3, specifically on Windows devices like the ROG Ally, is to go into Documents, My Games, Fallout 3, and in the Fallout 3 .ini file, change the IFPS section from 0 to 60. To find that section easiest, just type in Control F and then search IFPS. And yes, I was able to get 3 hours and 45 minutes with the FPS being between 70 and 120 FPS. Playing Fallout 3 at 1080p at 120 FPS at only 8 watts is just incredible. And I highly recommend playing this specific way, especially with the settings I showed you, and remember to go into Documents in order to fix the frames issue. And now the next game is Fallout 4. I managed to get 2 hours and 40 minutes with this title and set the TDP to 12 watts and the resolution at 1080p of course, and I managed to get an average of 45 FPS. Depending on location, sometimes the FPS drops to 30, and that's at high settings. Sadly, Fallout 4 is one of those titles that requires a little more power, so you won't be able to go below 12 TDP if you want above 30 FPS at 1080p. But I pretty much almost got 3 hours with Fallout 4, so that's not too bad. And going to the next title on the list, it is Devil May Cry 4, and I got 3 hours and 25 minutes with this game, and I completed the entire game on the ROG Ally recently, and I set the TDP to 9 watts. Of course, the resolution is at 1080p, with the FPS fluctuating between 45 to even 100 FPS, and the graphic settings were set to high. Depending on location, the FPS will drop from 100 to 45. And these numbers are extremes from the times that you're indoors in these type of games or outdoors. And the next titles on the list is pretty much my favorite horror trilogy, and it kind of trumps Resident Evil, and that is Dead Space 1 Original. And I managed to get 3 hours and 45 minutes with this title at only 8 TDP. The resolution was set to 1080p, and the FPS was at an average 45, with the graphic settings set to very high. And for some reason, this game does run a lot better if you limit the FPS through Command Center to 120. And I think 45 FPS is great for a title such as Dead Space 1 Original. It doesn't require a lot of accuracy. All you have to do is pretty much shoot limbs, which for the kind of monsters you fight is extremely easy to find. And Dead Space 2 was the same, 3 hours and 45 minutes with 8 TDP at 1080p with an average of 45 to 60 FPS at very high settings with the 120 FPS limiter on in Command Center. And the last of the trilogy, Dead Space 3, was again 3 hours and 45 minutes at 8 TDP at 1080p between 45 to 60 FPS with very high graphical settings. And I find these particular horror titles to be just exceptional and unforgettable. If you haven't checked out the Dead Space trilogy, I highly recommend it. And now for the game that required a tiny bit more attention on my part, and that is the Dead Space remake. It's kind of sad hearing the news about Dead Space 2 remake potentially being canceled, if not confirmed to be canceled. I was really looking forward to that, but I kind of wanted Dead Space 4 more than a Dead Space 2 remake. And with Dead Space remake, I managed to get 2 hours. I set the TDP to 14 watts, the resolution to 900p, and the FPS fluctuated between 30 to 35, with the graphics settings set to high. And I specifically set FSR 2.0
to balanced, with RAS sharpening enabled for extra clarity, and of course, Radeon Boost and Radeon Anti-Lag to smooth out and have more consistent VRR with a game like Dead Space Remake. Now, the alternative would be to set the TDP to 13 watts and set the resolution to 720p at high settings with FSR 2.0 set to quality, with RIS sharpening enabled, of course, and this gives you around 2 hours and 25 minutes, and the FPS actually jumps to 40. So not only are you gaining almost 30 minutes, but you're gaining an extra 10 FPS on average. And the last resort, if you want to save the most battery as possible with ROG Ally and Dead Space Remake, you can set the TDP to 11 watts, but for some reason the TDP will sometimes hang around 9 to 10 watts. Set the resolution to 720p with medium settings, and you could actually go into the AMD software app and activate Radeon Super Resolution, or you can just go to Command Center and activate RSR, which is Radeon Super Resolution, but I recommend trying the AMD software first. And this helps a lot with Dead Space Remake's FPS. And set FSR 2.0 to balanced and have dynamic resolution enabled and set to 50%, as well as variable rate shading enabled. And I managed to get 3 hours with a brightness set to 50% with these settings, and of course the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned off. Now that's yet another 30 minutes added to Dead Space Remake, with it not looking too bad, but you do have to enable the dynamic resolution, which isn't the worst at times, but it still looks feasible and provides enough of an experience to feel like Dead Space Remake and to feel like enough of a jump from the original Dead Space 1. But my personal preference is to play Dead Space Remake at 18 watts TDP with, of course, 1080p high settings, and the FPS usually hangs around 30 to 35. And that gives me around an hour and 20 minutes of gameplay, but it's a horror game. It isn't an RPG, so an hour and 20 minutes is more than enough. But of course, I have pretty hefty power banks like the Move Speed, which I showed in another video, and at 18 watts, I get around 8 hours of gameplay, so it doesn't really affect me much. I can actually finish the Dead Space Remake with one battery. But yeah, I find all of these games tested to be pretty impressive on the ROG Ally, considering I played most of them at 1080p. But if there's anything I missed, and I'm sure there is because there's so many variations and different kind of custom settings that you can have for the ROG Ally and these titles provided. But yeah, there's going to be a lot more to come in terms of power saver guides, and I try my best to find the best settings. I searched tons of different Reddit conversations to find other people's custom settings for these titles. But yeah, let me know in the comments below if I missed anything, and thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a good one. Later.